My name is Lusanda Raphulu. I'm a partner in the Employment and Benefits practice based in Johannesburg, and I also head the practice. I will be moderating this morning's webinar. The topic of workplace vaccinations is being widely debated and is top of mind for many employers. And this is therefore a webinar that we thought would be of great value to you, our clients. I'm joined this morning by colleagues from multiple jurisdictions in order to tackle this topic and to hear the position from their home countries. They are from East Africa, Ernest, Wiltshire, Managing Partner, Bowmans, Uganda. Terry Mwango, Head of Litigation and Dispute Resolution, Bowmans, Kenya. Mintewab Afework Abebe, Associate at our alliance firm, Aman, Assefa and Associates Law Office in Ethiopia. From West Africa, we have Jumoke Lambo, Partner at our alliance firm, Udoma and Belo-Osagie, otherwise known as UUBO, in Nigeria. And from Southern Africa, Rajiv Gujadhur, Partner, Bowmans, Mauritius. Talita Laubscher, Partner, Bowmans, South Africa. And last but not least, Mabvuto Sakala, Managing Partner, Bowmans, Zambia. Before we get into the webinar, I would like to run through a few housekeeping matters, which hopefully will enhance this webinar experience for all of you. As participants, you are all automatically muted and the chat functionality has been disabled. So, should you have any questions during the webinar, please make use of the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be submitted to me, the moderator, and I will select a few to discuss with the panel at an appropriate time during the webinar. In addition, together with the invitation to the webinar, we asked you to submit questions that you would particularly like us to address today, and we will deal with as many of these as we can during the webinar. We received so many questions that we have changed our initial plan for the webinar to make sure that within the 1 hour time period, we fit in as many of your submitted questions as possible. Please note that we won't be providing written responses to questions. However, please also note that this webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be made available on our website later today at www.bowmanslaw.com. The first logical question to ask at a webinar like this is whether the law in each country actually allows an employer to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. In response to this question, the majority of our panelists answered no. An employer in their country may not unilaterally implement a mandatory vaccination policy. No's were received from Mauritius, Zambia, Kenya, and Nigeria. Uganda and Ethiopia gave a qualified yes based on the employer's health and safety obligations. In addition, airline staff in Ethiopia are required to be vaccinated, specifically cabin crew. In South Africa, the answer is yes, an employer can implement a mandatory vaccination policy, but employees have grounds for objection to such a policy. Now going into our panelists, Talita, Ernest, and Rajiv, please can you elaborate and give us more information in respect of the position in South Africa, Uganda, and Mauritius, respectively.
Thanks, Lusanda, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, in South Africa, this issue of the vaccination is very interesting because it involves the balancing of various rights. And one of the rights that we're talking about is, of course, the right to bodily integrity, which is contained in the Constitution. That right is given effect to in the National Health Act. And that act says you cannot get medical treatment without the recipient's informed, specific, and voluntary consent. Now, no right in the Constitution is absolute, and there are circumstances in which a right can be limited. The National Health Act specifically makes provision for the limitation of the right to get medical treatment without informed, voluntary, and specific consent in circumstances where it is prescribed by law or a court order, or if it is necessary because not getting the treatment may pose a serious risk to public health. Now, that principle is carried through in the most recent Occupational Health and Safety Direction. And in terms of that direction, an employer must do an assessment of its workplace and see in what positions there may be employees who may be in roles where they are not vaccinated, that might pose a serious risk to public health, or may be a serious risk to those employees or the employees' safety. So, for example, where there are many employees congregated in a workplace, like in airlines or in call centers or mines, it may be justifiable to require employees to take the vaccine. Similarly, in hospitals, it would be important that the medical staff are vaccinated because of the serious risk to public health if they are not. And that is also the principle applied to teachers. Of course, as Lusanda said, even then, an employee can object, and that objection can also be based on a right that is recognized in the Constitution. For example, your right to religious beliefs, or if the employee has a serious underlying medical situation or condition that would prevent them from getting the vaccine. It is important that those objections are genuine, and they will need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis by the employer. And the employer would need to reasonably accommodate those employees who object. And yeah, you know, it's a different question. What do you do if an employee cannot be reasonably accommodated? But we will get there later on. Just for now, the answer is yes, but, and it is a serious but. The principle is the serious risk to public health. So if an employee is working in their own office, somewhere on the 10th floor, no interaction with other employees, and the normal requirements of adequate space, mask wearing, hand sanitizing, and those things can reasonably apply, then forcing that employee to get the vaccine would probably be unfair.
Thanks, Talita. Ernest?
Thank you, Lusanda, and a very good morning to all our special guests joining us for this webinar. The context of Uganda is based on the occupational health and safety legislation. So that legislation, I think, very similar to legislation in other places, mandates an employer to ensure that the workplace is safe. So that obligation remains with the employer throughout, regardless of what is happening in a workplace. And that obligation extends to safety of employees, safety of the workplace, safety of people who come to that place. So third parties who interact with that workplace are all covered. And this obligation remains throughout. Now, the same law then also requires, because of that obligation, requires employers to have in place a health and safety policy. The text of the legislation does not delimit the extent to which that policy can be applied, or what can and cannot be put in that policy. So to that extent, we gave a qualified yes, because there is an obligation on an employer to have a policy on health and safety in place. To the extent that we don't have limitations on what can be included and excluded, if it's a matter of health and safety, we think that an employer is empowered to have in place such a policy, or at least propose such a policy. Now, the ultimate question that really has to be asked is simply this: is this intervention that is being proposed a reasonable intervention in the context of that workplace? So very similar to what Talita was saying, there will be places, workplaces, where it's a reasonable intervention. Medical facilities, places like that, it's a reasonable intervention. A small, factory dealing with the recycling of, I don't know, plastics or something, maybe not. And therefore, I think the ultimate question is to gauge how reasonable this intervention is in the context of the obligations that the employer has towards ensuring health and safety. Before perhaps I leave this point, I should also point out that Uganda has an Immunization Act done in 2017. In that act, there is power given to the Minister of Health by statutory instrument to order vaccination regionally, nationally, including mandatory vaccination. As we speak now, we do not have such a statutory instrument in place, and therefore, in the context of direct statutory backing for mandatory vaccine policies, we are still lacking behind. But the text of the primary legislation shows you that when it was framed, there was in mind a possibility that mandatory vaccination can be ordered. And the circumstances in which it would be ordered are called extraordinary circumstances in that law. And those include things like an epidemic. And the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic is really the extent of international spread. One goes international, one is perhaps more within the nation. So the position for Uganda is really that an employer is not precluded from making proposals of this nature. It is perhaps important to bear in mind that even when those proposals are made, employees and employees' organizations should be consulted. There is a consultative process, but not a process where they must give consent in the context of establishing that policy.
Thanks, Ernest. Very interesting, that reasonableness standard, but also that possibility for legislative intervention. Rajiv, please come in and tell us the position in Mauritius.
Thank you, Lusanda, and welcome to all our guests on the webinar. The position in Mauritius as it stands, Lusanda, is that the law does not allow for mandatory vaccination. Therefore, any attempt by an employer to impose a mandatory vaccination policy would not be valid or enforceable. What has happened in Mauritius is that since June of 2021, i.e. Last month, the Mauritius government has, through secondary legislation, imposed a restriction on any person to access educational institutions at all levels, daycare centers, be they government or privately owned, and within the healthcare sector, hospitals, clinics, dispensaries, private health institutions, unless that person produces his vaccination card, or in the absence of vaccination, a PCR test result effectively certifying that the person is COVID negative. So the regulations actually do not apply to students under the age of 18, patients of those health institutions, or persons who cannot gain access to procure medicines, who have to gain access to procure medicines effectively. The effect of the regulations on the workforce within the education and health sector is causing quite a stir in Mauritius. There is currently a raft of constitutional challenges that are pending before the Supreme Court, or in preparation against the regulations. The outcome of these will undoubtedly have a bearing on the likelihood of government actually imposing mandatory vaccination policy, which will impact the workforce. The thinking behind those challenges is that whilst technically there may not be a mandatory vaccination obligation in Mauritius, given the practical difficulties to carry out PCR tests and the costs of doing so, not only employees, but persons engaged in contracts for services in those sectors, and students above the age of 18 are claiming that the regulations are indirectly forcing them to get vaccinated by denying them the right of access to education or health services. So these challenges are actually based on the constitutional provision pertaining to the protection of property, which includes the body under Section 9 of the Mauritius Constitution. There is constitutional jurisprudence to the effect that in a civil case, it would be inappropriate to compel a person to submit himself to medical examination, which is actually a lower threshold than what is being expected, that is being asked of persons at the moment, in any circumstances which do not meet his will. There is actually also a judicial pronouncement in Mauritius to the effect that there is no case where the protection of fundamental rights and freedom of the individual can be more sacrosanct than where the protection relates to the body of the individual. My own opinion, Lusanda, is that in the event laws are actually passed rendering vaccination mandatory, constitutional challenges will have to pass the test of the exceptions under Section 9 of the Constitution. The main exceptions that come to mind are relate to any law that may be passed promoting public benefit by making provision for mandatory vaccination in the interest of public health and safety. Another constitutional ground that may be raised by the authorities in defense of such a measure is the protection and freedom of fundamental rights of other persons. Should the authorities succeed in proving that the balance of interest lies in favor of the public at large rather than the individual, which I'm of the view that they may well do, mandatory vaccination laws would not be held to be in contravention of the Constitution. As matters stand, the executive branch has publicly expressed the intention of imposing such an obligation should there be persistent refusal resulting in the prevention of the country achieving herd immunity. So therefore, we are a bit at a crossroad at the moment. The vaccination rate in Mauritius is somewhat above 50% of the adult population. And the mandatory nature of vaccinations is a question that is a live one at the moment. Employers are not, so basically employers are in a wait and see mode effectively as to how the cases pan out before the courts in Mauritius.
Very interesting. Thanks, Rajiv. And I think realistically, in many jurisdictions, we are going to need to see what happens in the courts. And I think some of the questions will have to be answered through court processes. The next question is specifically for you, Talita, and is one of the questions that has been pre-submitted by our clients. The question is, are there any active employer-funded vaccination schemes that are currently in place in South Africa?
I'm not aware of any specific funded ones. There are very strict rules in relation to the sourcing of the vaccine. And it is very important that the employers work with the Department of Health. It is definitely so that employers at, for example, mines, employers who have clinics can obtain, through those clinics, these vaccines, but that needs to be from a registered source and in cooperation with the Department of Health. It is definitely possible for an employer to say we will pay for a vaccine, for the vaccine if employees do not have the funds to pay for it or have medical aid cover. That is not, something that is not permitted. But yeah, it is very important. There are guidelines that have been issued by the Department of Health that deal specifically with employer sites that where employers work with the department, of course, those employees can be vaccinated. There's been very encouraging stories from the Eastern Cape where employees have been vaccinated at stores, for example, or even at SASA sites. So it is definitely happening, but as I say, there are strict regulations pertaining to working with the Department of Health in that regard.
I think an important question in this debate, especially because in so many jurisdictions there isn't a mandatory requirement that employers can put in place, is actually what happens if an employer wants to put a policy in place and employees don't want to get vaccinated, and what is the legal position there? And is it different if the job that the employee occupies actually requires vaccination. For example, if you're required to do a lot of international travel. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to weigh in on this question of what exactly can an employer do if employees refuse to be vaccinated. Let's start in East Africa. I'll ask Ernest, followed by Terry, followed by Mintewab, to weigh in on this question.
Thank you, Lusanda. So back to our obligations as as an employer, the obligations in the the act that I refer to, health and safety, don't go away. Regardless of whether an employee is happy to participate or not, these obligations remain. And therefore, to that extent, an employer found in the position you've described will be in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, you want to try and ensure that you comply with the statutory obligations, make sure everything is safe and so on. On the other hand, you must respect the rights of the people who work in that space, and you must listen to them. So there are obviously very clear contradictions in that sense. You put a policy in place, people don't want to participate. What do you do? I think that the answer would really be context specific, workplace by workplace. Some of the examples you give may be more strict, airlines and so on, may be more strict in the approach that they take. But what I would recommend for any employer who's not in those places where you must strictly observe these policies and can punish if people don't comply, is to take an approach that is soft enough to try and win over hearts and minds, as opposed to taking no prisoners approach, where you say either or, agree or walk out. So that softly approach, will require that you provide adequate information to these employees, perhaps scientifically backed, so that the premise on which the policy is made or proposed is clear to all, has scientific basis, has proper facts, and then listen to the people who are objecting and try to understand what it is they are objecting about and why. There are some who just object because they can say no. There's some who have valid reasons to say, I don't want to participate. And I think some of the other panelists have talked about cases where you can say, I won't, for medical reasons, perhaps religious reasons, and so on. So my view would be, one, adopt an approach that is as soft as possible to try and win over hearts and minds. In the event that that doesn't work, maybe you put in place some level of escalation. Perhaps you consider excluding attendance at the workplace. If, for example, it's an outbreak that can be limited in time, you could consider doing that. In extremis, you could consider being spaces if that can even be afforded. Remote working is another option. But I want to conclude by saying that, in my view, an employer can, at some point, if they are able to demonstrate that they've done everything that they can do, that compliance is the policy is observed, and there are people who still don't want to participate, I think that an employer can take the decision to exclude this person from the workplace and separate. And in my view, having shown the things that the employer has done, it may not be possible for that to be found to be an unfair termination in those circumstances.
Are there any circumstances in Uganda that would justify dismissal, Ernest?
Please say that again.
Are there any circumstances in Uganda that would justify dismissal for employees who refuse to get vaccinated?
Yes, I think that, at the end of the day, the employer has a right, overarching, in my view, to exclude people from the workplace if they are not willing to comply with what are reasonable policies. Now, take an example of, you've got, let's say, 50 people, and 45 of them or 48 of them are happy to participate, and 2 of them just hold out and say no. What does that do? Perhaps it poses a danger to the rest of the 48, it poses a danger to other people who come. So in circumstances like that, I think one can come to the conclusion that termination is possible.
Thanks very much, Ernest. Terry, what's the position in Kenya?
Thank you, Lusanda, and good morning to all our attendees. As we say in Kenya, all protocols observed. As you had mentioned at the beginning, the position in Kenya is that an employer cannot have a mandatory vaccination policy. And I think that's been echoed by Ernest and my colleagues who've gone before me. I think the question then arises is, what do you do as an employer if you have encouraged your employees to get vaccinated, and there are some who opt not to, particularly where, for example, the function of their job requires that they travel. We all know from, the discussion and publications that have been put out in the media over the last couple of years that there will probably be a COVID passport required for travel. So for example, Lusanda, if I'm an employer and I have a sales team that comprises people who need to travel internationally, and perhaps a few of them decide that they choose not to get vaccinated, despite the fact that I don't have a mandatory vaccination policy as an employer, what that then means as an employer is that you would have to consider your options under the Employment Act. The Employment Act 2007 is the statute that really governs the employer-employee relationship in Kenya. But then it's very narrow in relation to the grounds upon which, as an employer, you can terminate your employees' employment. So outside of a redundancy, you can only terminate for poor performance, gross misconduct, or physical incapacity. So then the question would be, by the terms of that person's employment contract, can they fit into any of those three buckets in terms of them therefore not being able to perform their job? And in my view, the only bucket that perhaps would apply is physical incapacity, because if, for example, I decide that I don't want to get vaccinated for religious reasons, I think our courts would hesitate to say that that was an unreasonable position taken by an employee. Or for example, there are some employees who have comorbidities and so are not able to take the vaccination. So what happens if I'm a sales employee, I'm not able to take the vaccination, and therefore I'm not able to perform my job? So it certainly wouldn't fall under poor performance. I think there are grounds for arguing that it's perhaps physical incapacity in the sense that the person is not able to travel. I certainly don't think that it would fall under gross misconduct. And then the other question would be whether you can then terminate employees who refuse to take the vaccination. As Rajiv had mentioned earlier, this has not been tested in our courts in Kenya yet. But I think what employers will have to do is to look at the terms of the contracts that they have, especially with staff who are required to travel, and see whether the wording of those contracts would then place an employer in a position where they can require the vaccination as a condition for performance of the contract. Lusanda, thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Mintewab, what happens in Ethiopia?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Lusanda. It's very glad to be here discussing a very timely issue. In Ethiopia, it's just important to mention, to give a little bit of background. A little bit of shy of 2 million people are vaccinated as of June, and priority is still given to senior citizens. So the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs has not also legislated anything on the matter, primarily because the fact that vaccines are not widely accessible yet. Ethiopia is a civil law country, and most laws are passed through, in a form of legislations. And the current legislation that we have, So there are two types of employees in Ethiopia. One are managerial employees who are engaged in more of policy setting matters, hiring and firing of employees, and a more higher position of trust. Those are governed under a contract and a different set of laws, and a lot of flexibility is provided to employers with regards to managerial employees. The more complicated and nuanced position comes when it comes to non-managerial employees. Non-managerial employees are governed under a very recent law, Proclamation 1156/2019. Even though it's recent, it still fails to capture this extraordinary occurrence of a global pandemic, and it does not have specific rules on what happens to employees that refuse to get vaccinated in case of a global pandemic. But there are very interesting provisions under this law that may give leeways to employers to enforce a mandatory vaccination policy, and that's why we say a qualified yes here in Ethiopia. And it's very surprising because this law is very stringent and very pro-worker proclamation, and it was very interesting to see these loopholes where employers may enforce mandatory vaccinations. There are two grounds of termination for non-managerial employees provided under the law. One is a refusal to submit for a medical examination when it's required by law or by the employer. This the only exception is when it comes to a medical examination for HIV/AIDS. With the exception of HIV/AIDS, employees cannot refuse to undergo medical examination. The other interesting ground is if an employee refuses to observe the health and safety rules, including observing and taking safety precautions, then that will be also a ground for termination. So when we see the law in light of the general obligation that's imposed on employers to keep the health and safety of the employees, and also a counter obligation on the employees to observe these rules and to cooperate with the employers to enforce these rules, and these two specific grounds, and again, this is yet to be tested before the court. And again, a presidential decision may be passed by a cassation bench. We're yet to see, but we see these two grounds as that may be used by the employers to enforce mandatory vaccinations and to take measure against those employees that refuse to take vaccination. Now, if we see some examples of legitimate areas where an employer may actually mandate or require is when the employee has to travel for work, and the destination countries, if it's an international travel, require a mandatory vaccine. In that case, even though the employer may not be, even in the case that the employer may not be able to terminate under the previous grounds I've mentioned, the absence from duty may be another ground for termination. So again, I agree with the that have presented the different jurisdictions before me. An employer should take a very a softer approach, take into account the nature of the work, and take proportional and reasonable measures. But if we speak strictly legal measures, there are avenues we believe that may be used by the employers to take measure against employees. Lusanda.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much. Moving over to West Africa, Jumoke, can you also answer that question? And I'll also add for you one of the questions that have come in from our audience this morning, dealing with whether it matters about how many people have refused to be vaccinated. So Nazek Roberts has asked, why would 2 unvaccinated people be a danger to vaccinated people? So Jumoke, maybe you can also touch in, does it matter how many employees have refused?
Okay, thank you and welcome everyone. In terms of whether you can compel an employee to take the vaccination or what you should do as an employer if they refuse, as everyone has said, pretty much there are no laws in Nigeria at the moment. And so our advice to clients has always been, review the contract of employment. We have seen some contracts of employment where there is a term in there that includes taking vaccinations and certain processes to be followed in situations such as pandemics. So if you have those kind of provisions in the contract of employment, in your staff handbook, in your collective bargaining agreements where the employees are members of trade unions, then you can use your disciplinary procedures in that contract that regulate that engagement, and you can try to implement that and apply whatever sanctions have been approved for such infractions in the contract of employment. Of course, we're in a situation that's untested. We don't know how the courts will react, whether they will see this as an infringement of the employee's rights and one of the conditions in which they can vitiate a contract of employment. We don't know yet, but that right exists. Now, where the contract is silent on taking of a vaccine or being able to compel your employees to do that, then we believe that you can't sanction, of course. You can't do anything based on the contract of employment because that would amount to a unilateral amendment of the terms of the contract, which is illegal in Nigeria. And we have a plethora of cases on that. So what we have recommended to clients who have sought our advice is to say, look, the Nigeria Center for Disease Control has issued guidance for employers who are reopening their offices. And one of the things they encourage employers to do is to develop policies for working at home. So we say in those kind of situations, you can then have the employees work from home. The obligation of the employer, because we know employees could possibly bring a claim for discrimination, but the obligation of an employer really is to provide work. So as long as you're providing work, then really we believe that an employer has a good defense. Now, where the employment requires the employee to either be in the workplace or to travel, then that's where the issue arises. And we believe that there are circumstances that when the courts consider, they will find that really there is no other option because the contract has really been frustrated. Because if you're required to travel, for instance, and the airline says you must be vaccinated before you board, then it's nothing the employer has done. It's really the fact that you can't because of circumstances beyond the employer's control. You are forced, to consider what to do with that employee. And if you cannot reposition them anywhere else, then the logical conclusion would be that you would terminate such a person. So if there are any of those kind of circumstances, we believe that termination would be something that should be considered, and we believe the courts will recognize if challenged. In terms of how many people have been vaccinated, like I said, it doesn't really matter if you're able to rely on the NCDC provisions and say employees should work from home. If you give them work and they work from home, then you've complied with your obligations. What will happen? We all don't know. We believe that as offices start to open up again, we are going to see cases for different reasons around COVID-19 and the refusal of employees to take the vaccination. But in Nigeria at the moment, you can't compel employees unless it's already contained in the contract of employment. And so you have to use the soft approach, which we are recommending as well. Educate employees. A lot of them have myths around COVID-19. Demystify those myths, show them the science, show them what the records are, and hopefully encourage them. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Jumoke. Moving on to Southern Africa, Rajiv, can you answer that same question and also take a Q&A question? There's a question from Anonymous saying, does the public health grounds for imposing the vaccine, are they really justifiable in the absence of concrete evidence that the vaccine is efficient against the virus? So absent of concrete proof that the vaccine is efficient against the virus, can you really rely on public health grounds to say employees should get vaccinated in the workplace?
Thank you. Thank you, Lusanda. So effectively, there is a right by the employee to refuse to be vaccinated, given the lack of mandatory obligation. So it is possible for the employer, depending on the scheme of duties or the nature of the work conducted by the employee, to devise a policy with regards to workplace access that restricts access to an employee to work from the office, so long as the rights of the employee, and I will join what Jumoke had just mentioned, so long as the rights of the employee to fulfill his or her duties are not being infringed, and there is no discrimination between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated, the employer may restrict access or impose strict precautionary sanitary measures on the basis of which an employee may attend his or her workplace, for instance, by producing negative PCR tests results every other week. The legal basis for this proposition in Mauritius would be under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So effectively, employers are required, as far as reasonably practicable, to ensure safety and health and welfare of their employees at work. So in order to discharge these duties, the employer should ensure that it takes all reasonable actions to prevent the spread. The usual measures in terms of mask wearing, hand sanitizers, social distancing. In short, basically reasonable measures adopted and enforced in practice to protect from contamination would discharge the employer's duty. Therefore, whilst access may not be denied to the workplace or employment terminated purely on the ground of non-vaccination, alternatives may be devised to maintain safety at work, and which caters for the risk posed by non-vaccinated workers. I just like to add here, however, that this proposition must be balanced with the capacity of the employee to actually perform his duties as agreed under the employment agreement. For instance, in the event of an employee, as part of his scheme of duties, is required to actually travel regularly for work, and vaccination were to be mandatory from an international perspective, rendering performance impracticable, and there were no other alternatives available to the employer in the circumstances. And I would stress on that fact, there should be no other alternatives. I'm of the view that there would be actually a justifiable cause for the employee to be placed on leave without pay, or eventually to terminate employment should the employee fail to take steps to ensure performance. Just to add to this, the issue is somewhat exacerbated by the prospect of insurers getting in to provide, refusing to provide coverage to non-vaccinated staff, but in relation to COVID-related risks. And just to add to a live matter that is currently developing, actually, Mauritius has resumed its commercial flights since yesterday. But since last week informed its staff that stewards and air hostesses would not be allowed to work should they not have been vaccinated with both doses. The Union of the Workers have come out stating that there is no international airline authority sort of imposition of this rule, but merely a recommendation that staff should be vaccinated. So it would actually be interesting to hear the stand of the Mauritius on the matter, especially as in my view, and as for what I've explained as pertaining to the law in Mauritius as it stands, they may be acting ultra vires by not giving any other option to employees, for instance, PCR testing. So just to go back to the question on public health grounds, so does the public health ground for imposing the vaccine be justifiable in the absence of concrete evidence? What I have sort of come across is basically what the stand is by the government of Mauritius is effectively they are relying on the WHO recommendations on the question. And given that these are emergency measures that are being taken, and we are very far from actually coming to a concrete resolution of the matter, these are actually sort of justifiable in the circumstances, and this being a worldwide issue, it applies to just about everyone.
Thanks, Rajiv. Talita, can you come in on the position in South Africa and also cover the question that's coming in a lot in relation to what's been pre-submitted and also what's being submitted this morning about what happens if there's then workplace incidents of COVID-19. Is there direct liability for the employer if employees have refused to be vaccinated and now there's COVID-19 exposure in the workplace? What happens there? Is the employer exposed? Are there risk mitigation measures? Please advise employers in that regard.
Yeah, Lusanda, it is a difficult situation that employers find themselves in because they have a duty under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to ensure a safe working environment, not only for their employees, but also for third parties who come in contact with the operations of the employer. And if there is someone that contracts the illness in the course and scope of their employment, and one can prove that causal link to someone at the office, for example, then and the employee would need to claim compensation from the compensation fund that is set up under COIDA. I agree that the vaccine is not the be-all and end-all necessarily, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that it is, a complete foolproof mechanism to avoid COVID-19. I think it is one of the measures that can be taken in order to prevent the spread of the virus and also to reduce the viral load if it is contracted. And that is why we see the research results from countries like Israel, where a lot of individuals have been vaccinated and the mortality rate has reduced remarkably. And the hospitalization rate has reduced remarkably. And that means that the rate of infection is coming down, and it means that people do not get as ill as they would have gotten. So it's not only a protection for the individual who gets the vaccine, it is also protection for people who get in contact with someone who is carrying that virus and is not going to get as ill as they would have probably have been gotten. So that is what the science is saying to us at the moment. Of course, there is lots of differing opinions on the science, but that is, as my colleagues have said, the guidance that we are taking from the WHO. And it is important that we listen to that. In South Africa, if an employee refuses to take the vaccine, it will really depend on whether it is important for that employee to be vaccinated. Now, one must also remember that the purpose of the vaccine is to create herd immunity. And generally, 65–75% of people who have had the vaccine, that may then result in herd immunity. And if you transpose that back to the employment relationship and the workplace, if 90 employees out of 100 are vaccinated and 10 are not, well, potentially you already have herd immunity. So, will you now really insist on the other 10 to be vaccinated, or, what is the situation going to be? And that is why I said in the beginning, it is really important that you assess this on a case-by-case basis. We must also listen to some of the research that says people who are not vaccinated may very well be variant factories. And having seen the Delta variant and having heard the Lambda variant from South America, that's already in the UK, one is really concerned about how this virus adapts itself. And ultimately, it is each person's decision. And I agree with Ernest, that an approach by an employer that educates and encourages and genuinely listens to its employees, that is certainly an appropriate response. But also, on the other hand, there are circumstances where a mandatory vaccination policy may very well be the answer, for example, in the health sector.
Thanks, Talita. There's been the question about religious grounds. But I think most jurisdictions have said that religious grounds is one of the grounds on which people can object. I think that that's accepted, that religious grounds is one of the grounds on which employees can actually refuse to be vaccinated. While I've got you, Talita, maybe let me ask one of the other pre-submitted questions about if employers are required to give guidance to employees and try and convince them to agree. How can they do that? What about things like incentives to encourage employees to agree? Would that be discriminatory in relation to those who are not getting that incentive? What can employers do to encourage employees to get vaccinated without getting themselves into trouble on discriminatory grounds?
I would steer clear of incentives in the form of extra leave or a bonus or anything like that. I think what employers can do is to arrange for people from, for doctors or whoever, may be able to talk about the vaccine, how it's developed, the potential side effects, and educate in the workplace. I don't think that there can be an objection against an employer paying for employees who want to get the vaccine if they do not have adequate insurance cover. But yeah, I don't think that an employer ought to, pay a special bonus to employees who are vaccinated. I think that that does then, opens the door for discrimination claims. If someone has a reasonable objection based on religion or medical grounds, who then is not going to be able to be vaccinated and get that bonus. So I would steer clear of that.
Thanks, Talita. Mabvuto, can I please hand over to you? We're also getting a lot of questions from the audience, still very much worried about employer liability and how can employers help themselves in relation to liability, and the question of can they perhaps get employees to sign some sort of waiver indemnifying the employer from claims. So if you can touch on that, we are fast running out of time, but if you can come in and also touch on that.
Thank you, Lusanda. Thank you everyone for attending. It's a pleasure having you here. From a Zambian perspective, as you indicated in the introduction, Lusanda, an employer cannot implement a mandatory vaccine policy, but there are exceptions that can be developed, and two of them come to mind immediately. These are with respect to a situation where an employee can only perform work if they are vaccinated. Examples have been given, such as airline crews. That's one exception. The second exception is a situation where a non-vaccinated employee would cause a public health concern at the workplace with respect to co-employees, as well as to the members of the public that the employees interact with. Now, the question is, in those exceptional circumstances, what happens to an employee who refuses to take the vaccine? From a Zambian law perspective, I think there are three options that are available to an employer. Maybe we can make them four. Obviously, the first one is to try as best as possible to get everyone vaccinated, or to get as many of the employees vaccinated. And if you can break the myth around the vaccine by explaining to employees, that would be the best option. But if that does not work and you do not get sufficient employees vaccinated, and these are employees who must be vaccinated, then you have three other options. The first option is with respect to employees who have refused to be vaccinated because of an excusable legal ground. So excusable legal ground would be, for example, on the basis of religious belief or medical ground. Such employees who have an excusable legal ground cannot be terminated. So you cannot dismiss them because they have an excusable legal ground. And in such a case, the employer will have two options: either to let the employees proceed on unpaid leave until the situation improves, that is, either the herd immunity generally is achieved, or indeed the employees change their mind and they accept vaccination. That's one. But the other option is, obviously, because an employee is not vaccinated and cannot do their work, that may amount to frustration. So a contract can terminate on the basis of frustration. That's one option. The second option relates to employees whose excuse for refusing the vaccine is medical grounds. If an employee has a medical condition which would inhibit them from taking the vaccine, then the option that the employer has is to let that employee proceed on medical leave, which is provided for under the law in Zambia. And if the medical leave is exhausted, the employer has an option of terminating the employee on medical grounds, assuming the employee does not get into a position where they can take a vaccine within a reasonable time. The last option is with respect to employees who do not have an excusable basis for refusing the vaccine. For such employees, the employer has an option to terminate. So in the absence of an excusable ground, the employee would be said to be acting unreasonably. And for that reason, the employer may exercise their right to terminate or discipline them. Obviously, there's a process to follow before they can be terminated. Generally, to answer the question as to what the employer can do with respect to possible, threatened lawsuits because of safety at the workplace, I think what is important is to determine which employees must be at the workplace and which employees can work off-site. So in the event that the employer cannot restructure the workplace to make it safe, by, creating social distancing, and providing other measures to make the workplace safe, the option may be that the employees, some of the employees work from home. But if all those options are not available, and I think the question is quite important, the employer must consider that there is a possibility that liability may arise because a safe work environment has not been created. And the safe work environment, like Ernest indicated, is a statutory obligation that the employer has. So measures must be taken to ensure that there is a safety at workplace. And that can be created by maybe social distancing, etc. If that cannot work, maybe by working from home. If that does not work, then the three options that I've mentioned can be employed. Frustration of a contract, sending people on unpaid leave, and as a last resort, termination.
Thanks, Mabvuto. It is 11 o'clock. I think we've covered most of the themes in terms of what's being asked by the audience on the Q&A and what's also been pre-submitted. I'm going to take just one more question that's come up in the pre-submitted and today, and just ask you, Terry, to please deal with the question of data protection in relation to the vaccination status of employees. And if we've got some time, I'll ask Talita to deal with it in respect to POPIA. But if I can ask you, please, Terry, to just take a minute. We are out of time, and for Talita to take a minute and deal with it from a POPIA perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Lusanda. So from a Kenyan perspective, certainly the issues around the Data Protection Act 2019 are live. And what that means is that as an employer, if at all you do take a survey, for example, in relation to how many of your employees have been vaccinated, you would first have to obtain their consent in obtaining that information. And then secondly, you'd have to give full disclosure in respect of, one, what you're going to do with that information, and two, whether there'll be any transfer of that information. That's very critical. For example, with respect to employers who are multinational companies or who have a multinational presence. So for example, in the context of Bowmans, if the Kenyan office in Nairobi was to take that data and then share it with the offices outside of Kenya, if that had not been disclosed at the time of collecting the data, then that is potentially an infringement of the Data Protection Act. So just very quickly, in view of the time constraints, my short answer would be you have to obtain consent of your employees in relation to any information you want to collect about their vaccination status. And two, you have to give a full disclosure as to what you will do with that information, including any transfer outside of the jurisdiction and how and where that information will be stored. Thank you, Lusanda.
Thanks, Terry. Talita?
Yes, health information is treated very similarly in South Africa. Health information is regarded as special personal information under the Protection of Personal Information Act. And there are very specific and limited exceptions in which an employer can process the health information of its employees. That would include the implementation or the provision of laws, or collective agreements, which creates rights dependent on the health information of that data subject, or the reintegration or support for workers who are entitled to benefit in relation to sickness or incapacity, work incapacity. So those are very limited circumstances. And if one cannot fit it into those categories, one would need to rely on the employee's consent to get the vaccination status. Of course, it is one thing to consent to being vaccinated on the one hand, and it is another to give the employer that a copy of that vaccination certificate. Both would require consent. And yeah, you know, if there is a law that requires the employer to report on the number of employees who are vaccinated, one can potentially rely on that exception, the implementation or of the provisions of laws. But in the absence of that, one would need to get the vaccination certificate only by consent.
Thanks, Talita. And thanks very much to all our panelists. We really are out of time. We've had a record number of questions. We've tried to cover as many questions as possible. And we hope that you found this morning's webinar useful. Thank you very much. We hope that we've given you at least some of the answers that you really wanted to hear this morning. Bye, everybody.